Kia ora koutou. Hello, folks. Ko Pamela Bell, toko ingoa. I'm Pamela Bell, and I'm the Chief Everything Officer, the CEO here at the New Zealand Institute of Building. You have got us today for Industry Insights. This is where we do an interactive conversation with an international guest. It's inverted. It's all about your questions, and you can ask your questions on slido.com. The numbers on the bottom of the screen there, 74 021 69. So you're with us for 45 minutes, and we are in conversation today with Bronwyn Weir. Bronwyn is the Managing Director at Weir Legal and Consulting, and Bronwyn is going to be introducing herself. So please, Bronwyn, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I'm coming to you from Melbourne this morning, and I am a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for about 25 years, and my practice is exclusively working for government regulators in particular. In the first part of my career, I did a lot of work in building regulation, and that has become an area that I have some reputation in, and that led to me being engaged by all of Australia's building ministers, of which we have 8 state and territory ministers and a federal minister responsible for the administration of the National Construction Code, and they come together as a group called the Building Ministers Meeting. Those ministers commissioned myself and a very intelligent man called Professor Peter Shergold to draft a report called the Building Confidence Report. And that advised all governments on a roadmap for how to improve regulatory outcomes in the building industry and improve areas of compliance. That report was done back in 2017. It was published at the start of 2018 in Australia, and it was commissioned off the back of the Grenfell inquiry because it was realised by all those ministers that we had an awful lot of similar ACP product in Australia. And so they, and that was a symptom of a systemic issues in the industry. So our report was to advise them on that. So I've become quite well known in that area. But more broadly, I act for all different types of regulators, and my sort of main area of specialty is around regulatory practice and how regulators can be more effective, and also advising governments on reforms to assist with improved regulatory oversight. So that's me.
Awesome. Thanks, Bronwyn. It sounds very complicated having 8 different ministers. We think life's interesting here with just 1 or 2. I think another point to make, of course, is that we are talking with you with great interest because we've just received a presentation from the Building Commissioner in New South Wales, David Chandler, at our inaugural Build Up conference, which was held in March in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. And David's presentation was well received. It's also on our website under the Resources tab, along with a Radio New Zealand link to an interview that he did following that as well. So there's a lot of interest in the work of the Building Commission, and of course that work was spurred by your report, the Building Confidence Report. And if we could just, you started to give us some background information about the Building Confidence Report, Bronwyn. Really interested in how the different states have responded, given that you've got different approaches rather than one federal or national approach.
Yeah, so the very nature of doing a report like this, where you've got 8 jurisdictions all having slightly different approaches to how they regulate the building industry, was quite tricky, and coming up with a set of recommendations was really, as I mentioned, it was referred to as a roadmap for the states and territories. So as you'll appreciate, we came up with various recommendations, and each state and territory then would have, if they lined their scheme up against our recommendations, they would have gaps, and every jurisdiction had a different number of gaps and different types of gaps as against our roadmap. So similarly, the responses have been quite different. The idea was that if they all lined up to our recommendations, there would be improved harmonisation and consistency, which was a very big issue for industry and remains a big issue because of the impacts of our federal system. But similarly, the responses have been quite varied. It's fair to say that governments have cherry-picked from the recommendations, but also that 6 years on, it is still a very influential report in Australia. We still have governments making reforms in response to the Building Confidence Report, and it is used as a guide. And one of the things that has helped that was that all the ministers also commissioned some implementation work a couple of years after the report was released, which was done by our Australian Building Codes Board. So they produced model guidance for the states and territories to use to help them implement their recommendations. So there's quite a body of work around the report that is still being used by policymakers and still being referred to by industry regularly. And, you know, I couldn't tell you how many times I've presented on various issues relating to the report and still get asked to do so.
Absolutely, and we'll be at a 10-year milestone before long.
Yes.
Of the 24 recommendations, I noticed that a number are focused on building surveyors, design practitioners, and performance solutions. Of course, here in New Zealand, we're doing revisions to our New Zealand Building Act, and there has been consultation a number of years ago, and we have brought in changing requirements around the way we report and provide information on building products, as well as trying to obviously update our code mark and product certification. I guess we are similarly aligned in New Zealand in that we want to improve the quality of the built outcome. The thing that I find very interesting about your work, and it is in the title, Building Confidence, is about building trust in the industry. And that seems to be a point that David Chandler, as Building Commissioner, has picked up in New South Wales as well. Is there anything you would add to that, given that that's slightly outside the regulatory remit, but is there anything around that confidence and trust space?
Yes, well, we named it the Building Confidence Report because we said that there was a lack of confidence in compliance outcomes in the building industry. And that was really coming off the back of Grenfell and the issues we had around cladding as a major issue. We also had a number of other building product failures that were quite well publicised. And to be honest, in the first few months after the report was released, there was very little response from the ministers, and it seemed that this might be another report that would gather dust. And it wasn't until the Opal Towers tragedy and then a few months later, the Mascot Towers evacuation, which were, of course, two buildings that failed with nothing to do with cladding. But in fact, a number of our recommendations were relevant to the failures in those buildings, that our report sort of took on this broader, I guess, sense of attention by the governments. And I think now, particularly with the work that David Chandler's done, of course, his approach is to be quite active on social media. He names and shames quite regularly and has highlighted the defects in buildings, including, in addition to that, in Victoria, Cladding Safety Victoria, which was set up to spend $600 million to fix privately owned apartment buildings that had non-compliant cladding on them. They also did a report, and between these government reports that Chandler has done and has been done in Victoria, there's a consistent sort of conclusions that around 50% of our apartment buildings have serious defects in them. And so that does go to confidence levels in the community. But unfortunately, you have to uncover these things in order to get the imprimatur for change if you're constantly pushing these things under the carpet, and you're having people suffer in silence in long-winded building disputes and spending, tons of money and having awful impacts on their well-being, then it all goes along in silence. So there is this sort of double-edged sword by being much more public about it and how that affects confidence in the industry. But I think that you have to do that in order to get it the priorities that governments need to give it in terms of reform and actually doing something meaningful to change what's going on.
Yes, absolutely. The correlation between the well-publicised failures and then the momentum or the impetus for change. Certainly your report has been extremely successful in being turned into action beyond just more action plans or implementation reports. So congratulations on that. There was a point you mentioned also, I guess, the David Chandler response in terms of boots on the ground. That's also a really fantastic outcome. And I think what would be really interesting is to have a chat about well, say the New South Wales approach, which is a combination of regulation and industry leadership, versus some of the other approaches you're seeing in the other states. What can you suggest or enlighten us in? Because of course, at the Institute of Building, we're very interested in how we work with other industry leaders to create industry leadership, as well as how we advocate into government around regulatory changes.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that people often say is that if government's just regulated, we wouldn't need to do any more reform. They've got all of the rules are there, the powers are there, and they just don't use them. And to some extent, that's true. A number of our recommendations went to regulatory practice. As I mentioned at the beginning, that's sort of my area of expertise. And we did talk about governments needing to make sure they have all the powers they need, that they coordinate their oversight with the co-regulators like local government, for example, and the private certifiers in our systems here in Australia, and there needed to be better coherence there. But thirdly, that they needed to actually be proactive, particularly we call what we referred to as commercial buildings broadly, but essentially, that included the residential area where we knew there were these problems those years ago. And so we said that governments need to get on building sites whilst they're under construction to arrest these issues and have rectification taken care of before the buildings are handed over to the purchasers of those apartments. And so we made recommendations on those issues for government, and they still, very valid today. In fact, a lot of the work that David Chandler has done is around those recommendations and the way in which he has improved the effectiveness of regulation in New South Wales with boots on the ground and getting out onto these sites whilst they're under construction and making builders and developers rip out bathrooms and relay them because they've not been constructed properly and those sorts of things. And that all needs to happen. But at the same time, we have a massive skill shortage in our country, and I'm sure you do in New Zealand. And you actually need resources from industry to run those government programs. So you're taking away valuable resources to use as inspectors and others in government regulatory programs like that. And we certainly can't afford to have massive regulatory departments within governments with a whole bunch of resources that could be being used in the industry. So we can't have a regulator on every building site, and neither should we, because in fact, whilst the figure of 50% is a high figure and one which you would want to reduce, there is still a large proportion of the industry that is reliable and trustworthy. And the idea is for governments to focus their resources, keep them as limited as possible, and for industry to also do some heavy lifting around this. So industry associations need to be mini regulators in their own right. They need to eject people from their membership who are bringing that occupational group into disrepute and behaving improperly. They can't be sort of clubs or places where industry come together to work out how to, best get around loopholes and things. They really have to have high standards of professionalism in order to support the better outcomes across the industry. So it's incredibly important, and it's another area where David has really excelled because he's had industry at the table, but he's also put a lot of pressure on these industry associations to do more to lift the standards of their membership, to create valid and credible complaints processes when consumers come to them about their members, and to even create guidance and perhaps even in some cases in the fire industry, for example, auditing their own members to make sure that they're meeting the obligations that are on them in the scheme.
That's a really good point about the spectrum that industry associations can play in, as you say, from that complaints procedures and setting standards and guidance right through to accreditation or self-auditing. Is there anything you've seen industry associations do that you think we could learn from in New Zealand on that spectrum?
Yeah, one of the models that some of our jurisdictions have followed has been in relation to sort of practitioner registration or practitioner accreditation is to say, instead of government running a scheme like that and requiring you to come to government to get registered, that they will approve industry associations to run those schemes. And so we've seen it very much so in the area of engineering in Australia, in almost all jurisdictions. New South Wales is doing it in the area of fire safety practitioners, in a range of areas, so commissioning of fire safety systems, as well as annual essential safety measure reports post-occupancy. And so the Fire Protection Association of Australia, for example, has been approved by the government to run those schemes. And in order to obtain that approval, they have to have a reliable complaint system. And in the case of the FPAA approval, they have to audit their own members as well. And so we can sort of see some of these models growing where government is partnering with industry associations to deliver a version of a regulation framework, a registration framework, I should say, where the industry associations have to take on that regulatory role for their own members in order to be approved by government.
Absolutely. Okay. Look, this is leading us into the next question, I think, which is again in that accountability space in order to create quality built outcomes. Really interested in the work that you're working on now around accountability for developers. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, for sure. So this is an area where I guess my thinking has matured since releasing the Building Confidence report 6 years ago. And what sort of has become apparent is that the developers or the owners of these properties that tend to build and on-sell quite quickly through off-the-plan mechanisms have pretty much operated without accountability in Australia. There is, some rare exceptions to that, but essentially they're not able to be sued by owners if defects are found. Owners could only pursue builders for those defects. And there is a complete lack of accountability. They're often running projects through special purpose vehicles, which are folded up and walk away with profits. The developers tend to be the party that gets the most profit out of a build, yet the builders then with the shallow pockets are the ones who get sued. And if the defects are significant in terms of rectification cost, they end up with also becoming insolvent because they just can't bear that, whereas the developer has long gone with the profits from that development without any accountability and is off building the next lot of defective properties. They have massive influence on the outcomes for the project because they are often choosing the cheapest, the quickest, and pushing down price at every opportunity, not just in the tendering process, but throughout the build as well, and putting enormous pressure that flows through down the chain through to subcontractors. And so whilst they have a massive influence on quality and outcomes, they've had very little accountability in our system. That's changing in Australia. There's a recognition that developers are getting away without accountability. David has really led this through New South Wales. In New South Wales, developers can be sued for breach of warranty by owners post-occupation, and that actually has been in place now for 20 odd years, and it's the only jurisdiction in Australia where those statutory warranties extend to developers. But what David has brought in since his arrival is very strong powers where he can order developers to rectify, and he's used those in two ways. One, to go during construction, so about 6 months before completion of work, the developer has to notify the government that they're 6 months out from the issuing of an occupancy certificate, and the government then, through data and intelligence, lands on the riskiest sites and inspects. And if they find defects, and they do because their risk-based approach is directed at finding the sites where there's most likely to be defects, they will order the developer to sort those out, and they cannot get occupancy certificates and complete those off the plan sales until defects are rectified. So the boots on the ground during construction has been very effective. The other way he's used those powers is post-occupation with legacy buildings. So owners that are stuck in protracted defects with builders and developers have been able to put their hand up and ask for the Building Commission to come out and do an independent inspection. And if they find serious defects, which is inevitable because those owners are in protracted disputes over defects, they then order the builder and the developer to fix, independent of what's going on in the court system. So he's been very effective at bringing accountability back to developers. We've now got the ACT in Australia has got a bill going through Parliament creating developer accountability. They're choosing to actually require licensing for developers. They will also have powers similar to what David Chandler has that I've just explained in terms of orders on developers. But one of the additional things that they're creating through these new laws is director liability personally in certain circumstances. And so what they've said is that if a developer becomes insolvent and they do not have decennial liability insurance or similar product for their build, that the directors personally will be able to be issued with rectification orders. So that's new. And we've also got Queensland and Victoria. Both governments are also looking at either some sort of licensing scheme for developers and or increased accountability mechanisms. So we seem to have almost reached a bit of a tipping point where the governments have realised that developers have to be on the hook for these buildings and that it's more effective to require them to take accountability for defects than it is to focus on, say, the trades right down at the other end of the chain who have limited control over outcomes because of the pressure that is put down the chain on them.
Well, that's really interesting range of advice and action that we can see from the different states in Australia, and New Zealand will be watching that closely. You mentioned decennial, the 10-year insurance in relation to ACT. I'm aware that in New South Wales, there's also that conversation. I wonder if you can just touch on that, and also if this conversation around data and analytics and the role of information to help us identify the risky players. You and I, well, certainly my pleasure in meeting you a number of years ago around the development of iCert, which is the acronym for the Independent Construction Industry Rating Tool, which is, of course, a customer or end user focused way for data and analytics to add up to a 5-star rating system so that people who are prospective homeowners could get an idea who they were literally getting into bed with from a contractor or developer point of view before buying off the plans. Can you let us know anything more about the use of decennial insurance or the iCert to help improve building quality?
Yeah, so these are two market-driven products, and whilst they have been taken up in New South Wales through significant encouragement from David Chandler, who's been quite active in the development of these products, simply through his influence, not through any legislative reform. They are products that are available outside of New South Wales and could be purchased by anyone involved in the industry, and indeed, I'm sure people from New Zealand could inquire as to these products. So the decennial liability insurance is a market-driven product. It's not yet mature enough for governments to mandate decennial liability insurance, but they're all chomping at the bit to be able to do so. And so the example of director liability that I just mentioned is a way of encouraging the uptake of decennial liability insurance so that directors won't personally be subject to those rectification orders. But as you mentioned, in New South Wales, there's been reports of quite a number of projects now picking up decennial liability insurance, which is a market-driven initiative. So not yet mandatory, but encouraged, and there's quite a bit of uptake. So it's a positive sign that the insurance industry is coming back into the sector through the work of the New South Wales Commissioner, where there's been such improvements to regulatory outcomes there. iCert is that second product you mentioned, which again has been instrumental in giving owners the ability to make choices about and compare different developments that they might choose to buy apartments in through the iCert rating, which is a public-facing rating for a developer or a builder. Again, not mandatory at all, but the way in which David encouraged for this to be taken up was that he went to the best developers in the industry and said, you all need a rating to distinguish yourself from those that aren't doing the right thing. If you want to help me clean up this industry, they started to jump on board with that. And of course, it became a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom, which is what we often see in the industry. And so now I believe that roughly 70% of the tier 1 and 2 builders in New South Wales have an iCert rating. And what David is finding as well in the work around legacy buildings is that where the developer or builder has an iCert rating, in 100% of cases, they are cooperative about fixing their defects post-construction. So iCert's working in a number of ways. It's in the ACT scheme that's been proposed. In order to be licensed as a developer, the applicant for the license will have to have an iCert rating. So again, it's being used there not as a mandatory requirement, but in order to have a license, you'll need one. So these products are now being, because they've been created and they're in the market, the governments are now looking as to how to encourage their uptake in Australia, which is a really positive thing.
That's so interesting, this relationship between industry or market driven and the regulatory.
And the role of government in that, Pam, because a lot of the governments are quite nervous about iCert and DLI because at the moment, in both cases, there's only one provider in the market. And so governments tend to be very reluctant to endorse or recommend when a private entity appears to have a monopoly. And that's a valid concern. But of course, David he would love to have other players in the market. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg because unless there's a market for that, you won't have multiple private entities offering those services. There is quite a bit of talk about additional insurance providers coming into the market on DLI. So that will be good to see. I guess in terms of the iCert product, whilst there's only one provider at the moment, they are a regulated ratings agency in their own right under separate regulations in Australia for ratings agencies. So they do have some credibility in terms of being regulated themselves to provide these sort of ratings services. Which gives some level of comfort to governments to rely on their rating product.
Absolutely. No, it's a really interesting conversation, isn't it, between regulation and industry or market and incentives for good behaviour. At the end of the day, though, hopefully it is that homeowner or user that benefits, right?
Oh, of course. That's got to be the lens through which all of this is viewed.
Absolutely. And it's really good to discuss the role of the developers. We also wanted to talk with you about this emerging role of project managers, because over a quarter of the members here at the Institute of Building identify as project managers, whether that's for the client, a consultant, or a construction side. So tell us about what you have learned about the role of project managers.
Yeah, this is a really interesting group of practitioners in the chain. The rise or the volume of project managers in the system has increased significantly over the last 15 to 20 years, and that's off the back of the creation of these construction management degrees and tertiary degrees that were brought into the mix probably 15 years or so ago. And what I think has happened is that it's become, getting a tertiary degree has become sort of a way of legitimising the career pathways for builders, but it's also become an alternative pathway for people that might have otherwise gone into engineering, building surveying, or architecture even. And one of the things that makes it more attractive than those other three professions is that when you get to the other end, there is no accountability. You don't have to get registered. You don't have to go through any other hoops, and yet you can have quite a bit of influence on a project. And so we have project managers now that may be engaged in all different sorts of ways. So they could be engaged by the developer, they could be part of the builder's team, or engaged as a separate entity to the builder. And their roles can vary from project to project. And so actually defining what a project manager is and who they would be engaged by and how you might bring accountability or competency requirements to them is really quite difficult because they perform so many different roles. And yet they have an enormous influence. So in the Building Confidence report, we did say that this was one of the key groups in the chain that should have some sort of registration and accountability framework over them because of the influence they have on projects. And none of the jurisdictions have really taken that up. I must say that the discussion we've just had on developers, I think, really goes to this issue as well. I mean, if you're licensing developers, do you need to also have project managers who tend to sit between the developer and the builder in one way or another? And that's sort of a live question to think about. But this prevalence of project managers now, their influence over the process and their lack of accountability, to me, is really an issue that's worthy of further debate and discussion.
Absolutely agree. And I have also seen a recent industry survey by a data analytics independent group that says a similar thing, which is that there's some confusion about the number of people in the chain and the value that some roles bring to the project. I think we're interested here in terms of what we can do to help in that space. One of the things we are doing is working with the Project Management Institute in New Zealand to develop a scope of services for the client or consultant side. We can see that a lot of the construction side project management roles get formed up by the position description, I guess, within an individual company, and that depends on whether it's a larger, like a tier 1, tier 2, or a smaller SME size business, so that the role itself can vary a lot on the ground, depending on the projects and the entity they're working in.
Yeah, I think defining the role is really important, and perhaps even recognising that there can be some flexibility in that role, because there's no point trying to stick square pegs into round holes. But what really also needs to be defined is what are the practices that we expect of this group of professionals, and what are the ethical responsibilities that they have in their role, and is there a good understanding of that? And of course, the whole sort of core of what it means to be a professional is around having those ethical principles that guide decision-making and conduct within any given profession. And so it's probably a profession that's grown so quickly, and there hasn't necessarily been that clear definition around ethical responsibilities and how they interface with the different practitioners throughout a project. And certainly I think one of the criticisms I've heard around the role of project managers is that they tend to push out the consultants like the engineers, the architects and the building surveyors from the process. Those that have a professional and ethical responsibility around delivery of their services are often sidelined by the project manager and only brought in on an as-needs basis, and kept their roles to a minimum to keep costs down and also to stop interference with the project by those consultants which are trying to achieve sort of more ethical outcomes. So that is an area, I think, for project managers as a profession to really look at, because I think that has led to inadequacy of design, building surveyors being kept out of decisions like product substitution, or design changes that occur particularly under design and construct contracts. And the same with engineers not being kept involved in the project and doing regular inspections and other things of engineering design through the project in an effort to keep costs down, but in the same time losing potential quality and outcomes and compliance and safety issues.
Absolutely. Well, there's some homework for us in there, I think. Thank you. Yeah. Which brings us to the fifth of our topics, and we have touched on various areas that industry associations and market can provide alongside government in its role in regulation. What else do you think we need to be aware of in terms of industry's role, or what can you see happening in Australia that we might learn from?
Yeah, I think perhaps recapping on some of the comments we've already made in this session, industry associations need to be more professional. It's quite a difficult tension, because in order to function financially, they need members, and they need people to pay a membership and to think that they're getting something for that membership. But at the same time, you need to be choosy about who's in your membership ranks and how the reputation of your industry group is affected by poor practices of people that are associated with your brand as an association. So it is really important for industry and industry associations in particular to be mindful of their role and who they're actually delivering their services to. So often industry associations talk about protecting their members, but it's in fact the consumers that are purchasing their services or the end users of their services that we need to protect. And if we all focus on those consumer outcomes, that does slightly change the stance on certain issues, because you're not just protecting your members or trying to find a way for them to be more financially successful or, as I said earlier, to work out where those loopholes are that somehow you can take a high moral ground because you're not actually breaching the law, when in fact you could be having a negative impact on outcomes and safety. And so it is about that, having that ethical standard around everything that industry does and making sure that members understand that obligation. So I think that's really where the shift is for industry. We've had lots of discussion about this in Australia in terms of industry, particularly industry bodies not having very good complaints mechanisms when consumers come to them about their members, and essentially becoming a protection for poor quality services for certain practitioner groups, as opposed to really upholding the standards. And in some areas, and I won't name particular professions, you know, I've had a number of people say to me that they no longer want to be a member of certain professional organisations in Australia because of the sorts of people that have membership there and are not being held to account when complaints are made about them. And so you sort of have this perpetuating cycle where the good ones no longer want to be associated with that brand because the bad ones are allowed to flourish underneath that membership and continue to deliver poor services and bring that profession into disrepute. So it's a fine balance for industry, but industry associations, I think, really do need to think about the end user and about retaining the most ethical and responsible practitioners in their membership at the expense of the ones who are doing the wrong thing and bringing the profession into disrepute.
Absolutely. And look, there's a little story behind the picture that we're looking at here, which is this was a site visit to the Christchurch Cathedral, which of course suffered great damage during the devastating Canterbury earthquakes 2011, 2012. So we went to look at this, and you'll see a number of our members in that photo. We went to look at this alongside our New Zealand Building People Awards, which we held in Christchurch, Otatahi, last year. And one of the ways that our institute is upholding good ethical behaviour is through our national awards program, the New Zealand Building People Awards, which coincidentally we've just opened today for nominations for this year. But the thing that we did last year is we reframed towards people. It's the New Zealand Building People Awards. So it's the people who deliver the project, and the criteria or the judging aspects are all aligned with Te Ao Māori or tikanga, which is the principles of really great behaviour around how we turn up, how we mentor, how we are personally invested in our own development, and how we're bringing, I guess, essentially professionalism, but teased out into 10 specific areas around criteria. So not just technical expertise, but how we communicate with our teams and how we bring others around us. And it was a fabulous experience because we managed to get across the stage a number of people who had developed and delivered projects alongside team members, and there was lots of great cultural integration, and really the people behind the projects really shone. But one of the other things in this picture, of course, is the mobile phones which are taking the photographs. And I'm really interested, something you and also David Chandler have in common is a really great command and presence in social media. So there's also something there that industry can do, isn't there? What would you say?
So yeah, social media is incredibly powerful, and again, one of the things that sets David apart from most regulators is his willingness to name and shame. I mean, most regulators are pretty frightened about doing that sort of thing. I don't think anyone's made a defamation claim against him yet, and of course, as you know, defamation doesn't apply where what you're saying is true. So it is really important to for leaders to put out strong messages that always go to issues of integrity and consumer outcomes. I mean, they are the key issues: integrity, competency, consumer outcomes. And if messages are also always around those issues and thinking of it through the lens of those really important principles, then that can influence outcomes as well. And we know that social media is a very thriving space, and where messaging can have a really big impact. So I'm certainly not as active as David is on LinkedIn and those sorts of places, but it is a really important part of my business and a part of being a commentator in the industry.
Okay, and you're using it, as I can see it, to shine a light on things. Are you using it also in an inquiry, curiosity, to get feedback or information back? Or, I mean, apart from shining a light on your work, how else could we be making the most of social media?
Yeah, look, I don't use it in that way, but there are some people that use it really well like that. There's one building surveyor I can think of in particular that is every week or two will post some questions about, I've just had this scenario and this is what I've done and this is what I could have done and what do people think about that, and seeking feedback on. And in most cases, the responses are around, ethical behaviour or realising that these dilemmas are everyday issues and putting them out there for discussion amongst colleagues. And I think that can be a really useful way for some people to interact and to think about these issues on a regular basis, rather than coming to some sort of formal session on ethics or have to read some document on it, to just have these issues brought up through the informality of social media, so that people can think about them in their everyday work as they follow what's in their feeds.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point around circle of knowledge and how we can make most.
Yeah, communities of practice, and actually making yourself vulnerable by putting these sort of questions out there and saying, well, this is what I did. Did I do the right thing? I think can be really helpful for communities of practice.
Awesome. Thanks, Bronwyn. We are very close to wrapping up. I have a couple of closing comments just to let people know about the next industry insights. Bronwyn, is there anything we've missed or anything else you wanted to add? I did notice something on your LinkedIn profile, which I wanted to touch on, which was that you also have roles in governance and you have a role in social housing, I believe. Was it with Melbourne City Mission?
Yes, I do. Yeah, community housing provider. That's been an incredible role, actually. I'm learning so much from being on the board of a body that receives government funding to do development. So we're effectively a developer funded by government to create social housing. And we have to engage in that process, of course, with the whole gamut of builders and consultants to deliver projects. And interestingly, in more recent times, because of the way the market is in Australia, there are a lot of developers now that are entering into this space to pair up with community housing providers. So my sort of thoughts and comments around developers are being sharpened and developed through my role as a board member of a community housing provider.
Absolutely. You're essentially a build-to-rent owned developer, aren't you?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
I'm on a board like that here too. And social housing is very close to my ethical guidelines. Is there anything else that you're in governance on? I saw a couple of other things.
Yes, I'm a non-executive director of a startup that's involved in creating an IT platform for building documentation, which is sort of under development at the moment. We've been going for a little while, and we're sort of developed a product where people can store building information for buildings during construction, but also post-construction, and increasingly too for existing buildings to be able to digitally capture information about the buildings. There's so many stakeholders that need digital information about buildings, from the building managers, owners, insurers, regulators, to ensure compliance. And so that's another really interesting area that I'm involved in, is that sort of digital documentation space.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. And there's been some action in that space over here in terms of what a digital wallet is like for construction. And of course, it's a blend, isn't it, between like a car maintenance manual and a Dropbox, if you like.
Yes,
yeah.
That's right. So recommendation 20 of the BCR was for building manuals to be mandated. And so the business that I'm involved in is involved in that side of things as well. So, but of course, we only build 3% of new buildings a year. We've got an enormous amount of existing stock, and we need to find a way of digitising information about buildings, including ongoing compliance information in terms of fire safety, maintenance, and those other areas as well. So it's a big new area, not to mention material provenance and product information. And then the big interest of governments, of course, around sustainability credentials and carbonisation, which is coming at us very quickly.
So I think we're absolutely aligned in all those activities around information requirements. Bronwyn, thank you. We've asked questions. You have answered us in full and extremely intelligently. Thank you very much. We want to say thank you for being part of Industry Insights today. For our folks listening, and this is also recorded and on the resources section of the Institute of Building website, the next Industry Insights will be on the 16th of May next month, and it will be looking more closely at our H1 regulatory changes, and we'll be hearing from the folks at Comfortech around the insulation requirements. So we'll see you back then for then. And in the meantime, thank you again, Bronwyn, and
Welcome.
to everybody listening. Ka kite anō. See you next time.